In October 1978, a young pilot took off from southern Australia on what was supposed to be a routine night flight. The journey was short, the weather was clear, and there was no reason to expect trouble. He never arrived at his destination. His name was Frederick Valentich. He was 20 years old, flying alone in a small aircraft across the Bass Strait, a stretch of open water separating mainland Australia from Tasmania. By the end of the night, both he and his plane had vanished completely. Less than an hour after takeoff, Valentich contacted air traffic control with an unusual request. He asked whether there was any other aircraft flying below 5,000 feet in his area. The controller checked and replied that there was not. Valentich then said something that immediately changed the tone of the conversation. He reported that there was an object flying above him. When asked to describe it, Valentich struggled. He said it had bright lights. He said it was moving in a way he did not recognize, and he said more than once that it was not an aircraft. Over the next several minutes, the controller listened as Valentich described the object circling his plane, passing overhead and reflecting a metallic surface. His voice was calm, but increasingly tense, as if he was trying to remain professional while processing something he could not explain. Then Valentich reported another problem. His engine was running rough. The sound had changed. Something was wrong. The controller asked him to confirm his altitude. Valentich responded, but his attention kept returning to the object. He said it was still there, still circling. His final transmission was not a mayday call. It was not a cry for help. He simply said once again that the object hovering above him was not an aircraft. Immediately after that, a strange metallic scraping sound came through the radio. It lasted for 17 seconds. Then the transmission stopped. Frederick Valentich was never heard from again. When he failed to arrive, a massive search was launched across the Bass Strait. Aircraft and ships covered thousands of square miles of ocean over several days. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no debris, no confirmed crash site. What made this case different from most aviation disappearances was that Valentich's final moments were recorded. His voice, his descriptions, and the unexplained sound were all preserved, leaving behind a mystery that has never been fully resolved. Tonight, we're unpacking what happened during Frederick Valentich's final flight, the official explanations, the details that don't quite fit, and why, more than 4 decades later, this disappearance still divides opinion. To understand what may have happened to Frederick Valentich, investigators first looked closely at the pilot himself. Valentich was not a novice, but he was also not highly experienced. At the time of his disappearance, he had logged just over 150 hours of flight time, most of it during training. His instructors described him as capable, but they also noted recurring issues with navigation and spatial awareness. He had failed several exams during his training, including portions related to instrument flying. These details would later become central to the official explanation. That night's flight plan appeared ordinary on paper. Valentich departed Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne and planned to fly south across the Bass Strait to King Island, then continue on to Tasmania. He told flight services that he intended to pick up passengers at King Island. Later investigation found no record of anyone waiting for him there. This detail raised questions, but it was never determined whether Valentich had misunderstood, misspoken, or simply intended to land briefly before returning. Weather conditions that evening were favorable. There were no storms, no strong winds, and visibility was reported as good. The sky was clear enough for stars and planets to be visible, a fact that would later factor heavily into analysis of what Valentich claimed to see. When Valentich first contacted flight service at around 7:06 p.m., his voice was calm. He asked a simple question about nearby traffic. Nothing about the call suggested distress. When the controller told him there was no known aircraft in the area, Valentich paused, then replied that there was something above him anyway. From that moment on, the exchange changed. Valentich did not jump to conclusions. He did not say the object was hostile. He did not claim it was attacking him. Instead, he described its movement. He said it was circling his aircraft. He said it had bright lights. He said it moved too fast and too smoothly to be another plane. At one point, he said the object passed directly over him. He described a shiny metallic surface and a green light. The controller asked him again to identify it. Valentich hesitated, then repeated that it was not an aircraft. That hesitation has been studied closely. Some investigators believe it shows uncertainty and confusion. Others believe it shows the opposite, that Valentich was actively trying to fit what he saw into known categories and failing. As the conversation continued, Valentich introduced a second problem. His engine was running rough, the sound had changed, and the aircraft no longer felt normal. For pilots, this combination is dangerous. Visual confusion combined with mechanical trouble dramatically increases cognitive load. Decisions become slower, attention narrows, small problems feel larger than they are. The controller asked Valentich to confirm his altitude. He responded accurately, suggesting he still had access to his instruments and was not completely disoriented. But his focus kept returning to the object. He said it was still circling him. Still there. His final spoken words were simple and unsettling. He said, once again, that the object hovering above him was not an aircraft. Then came the sound. For 17 seconds, the radio transmitted a metallic scraping or grinding noise. It did not rise and fall like static. It did not resemble a single impact. It sounded mechanical, sustained, and abrupt. Then the transmission cut out entirely. No mayday was issued. No crash was reported. No further communication occurred. When Valentich failed to arrive at King Island, authorities launched a full search and rescue operation. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the Bass Strait. Ships scanned the water for debris or oil slicks. The search continued for days. Nothing was found. The Bass Strait is deep and unpredictable. Strong currents can scatter debris quickly or pull it beneath the surface. Small aircraft that strike the water at speed often break apart and sink rapidly. Investigators concluded that Valentich likely crashed into the ocean. The official report listed the cause as a presumed fatal accident, exact cause unknown. But that conclusion raised as many questions as it answered. One explanation focused on spatial disorientation. Flying at night over open water removes the natural horizon. Without visual reference points, the brain can misinterpret motion. Lights can appear to move when they are stationary. A slow bank can feel like level flight. In this state, a pilot can unknowingly enter a descending spiral. As the aircraft turns, stars and planets appear to circle. Lights seem to pass overhead. The illusion can feel external, convincing, and persistent. That night, Venus was visible in the sky. Some experts suggested Valentich may have mistaken it, or other celestial objects, for something following him. Reflections from cockpit lights could have reinforced the illusion. The engine trouble may have been carburetor icing, a known issue in small aircraft. It can cause rough running and power loss without warning, especially in cool conditions. If Valentich was already disoriented, the engine issue could have intensified his stress, narrowing his focus even further on the perceived object above him. Under this explanation, the metallic sound heard on the radio may have been interference caused by the aircraft's antenna vibrating as the plane entered a steep descent, or airflow distortion as control was lost. This explanation fits aviation science, but it does not fit everything. Valentich remained articulate throughout the exchange. He did not slur his words. He did not sound panicked. He responded to questions logically. Severe disorientation often produces more obvious confusion. There were also reports from the ground. Several people later claimed to have seen unusual lights over the Bass Strait around the same time. One described a green light moving erratically. Another claimed to see a small aircraft followed by a larger glowing object. These reports were inconsistent and could not be verified, but their timing aligned closely with Valentich's last transmission. Years later, a piece of aircraft cowling washed ashore on Flinders Island. The material appeared similar to that used on a Cessna aircraft. However, it lacked serial numbers and could not be conclusively linked to Valentich's plane. Officially, it was ruled inconclusive. Unofficially, it kept the case alive. What makes the Valentich disappearance so difficult to dismiss is that it exists on tape. This is not a story built entirely from rumor or reconstruction. The final minutes were recorded in real time. Listeners hear a young pilot trying to make sense of something unfamiliar. They hear professionalism strained but intact, and then they hear a sound that should not be there. If Valentich was mistaken, then the human mind proved capable of creating a reality convincing enough to override training and experience. If he was not mistaken, then something entered his airspace that night and left no trace behind. Either way, the ending does not change. A routine flight vanished. A voice stopped mid-sentence. And more than 40 years later, the Bass Strait still holds the answer. As more time passed, investigators began to realize that the Valentich case sat in an uncomfortable middle ground. It was too well documented to be dismissed as rumor, yet too incomplete to be resolved through evidence. Every review ended the same way, with conclusions followed by qualifiers. One of the most debated aspects remained Valentich's mental state in the final minutes. Aviation psychologists noted that fear alone does not usually produce coherent, sustained reporting. Panic tends to fracture speech and accelerate decision-making. Valentich showed neither. Instead, his behavior suggested concentration. He stayed on frequency, he answered questions, he corrected details. This indicated that, at least until the final seconds, he believed he was still in control of the situation. That belief is critical. Pilots who believe they are moments from impact often declare emergencies immediately. Valentich did not. He never used the word mayday. He never asked for vectors or emergency landing options. This implies that in his own mind the situation had not crossed the threshold into catastrophe. That raises a disturbing possibility. If Valentich was disoriented, then the illusion was not momentary. It was stable enough to feel real, persistent enough to command his attention, and convincing enough to override normal emergency response. In aviation, these kinds of illusions are well known but rarely recorded in such detail. Most are reconstructed after crashes, inferred from wreckage and instrument readings. Valentich's case is different. The illusion, if that is what it was, is described as it unfolds. Listeners hear the moment when uncertainty replaces routine. When an ordinary flight transitions into something unfamiliar, not with a sudden shock, but with creeping doubt. Another detail that continued to trouble analysts was the timing. Valentich reported engine roughness after he began describing the object. This sequencing matters. If the engine issue came first, it could explain stress and misinterpretation. But if the visual disturbance came first, then the engine issue becomes secondary or coincidental. That order cannot be confirmed with certainty, but Valentich's phrasing suggests the object captured his attention before mechanical symptoms appeared. For skeptics, this does not change the conclusion. Stress can manifest before mechanical failure. The brain often senses trouble before instruments confirm it. For others, the timing adds weight to the idea that Valentich was responding to something external, not internal. The metallic sound at the end of the transmission continued to resist classification. Audio engineers ruled out several common explanations. It did not match typical static bursts. It did not resemble microphone knock or signal dropout. It had texture, variation, and duration. 17 seconds is a long time in aviation audio. long enough for something to be happening, not just failing. Yet without the aircraft, interpretation remains speculative. The sound exists without context, suspended between accident and anomaly. As decades passed, the recording itself became the center of the mystery. Not what Valentich might have seen, but what he experienced. His words, preserved exactly as spoken, removed the safety net of hindsight. You are not hearing a retelling. You are hearing a moment unfold. This is why the Valentich case refuses to fade. It does not rely on imagination. It relies on evidence that stops too soon. In many disappearances, the unknown lies in what happened after the last sighting. Here, the unknown begins while the person is still speaking. That reversal unsettles people. The case does not ask whether something strange happened. It asks whether certainty itself can fail under the right conditions. If this was an accident, then it demonstrates how fragile perception can be, even for trained individuals. If it was not, then it demonstrates how little control we have over what enters our environment unnoticed and undocumented. Either interpretation carries discomfort. Frederick Valentich did not leave behind a dramatic final moment. He left behind a conversation that never reached a conclusion. No answer interrupted him. No confirmation corrected him. No final event explained him. Just silence. And in that silence, the case continues to exist, not as a solved event, but as an open question, waiting where certainty should have been. As the Valentich case aged, something unusual happened. Instead of becoming clearer with time, it became more fragile. Each new explanation relied more heavily on interpretation than evidence, and each new analysis exposed how little could actually be proven. This is where the case separates itself from most aviation disappearances. Normally, uncertainty shrinks as investigations mature. In Valentich's case, uncertainty hardened. The facts stayed fixed, but their meaning remained unstable. The radio transcript was re-examined repeatedly. Linguists studied Valentich's phrasing. Aviation specialists reviewed his word choices. Psychologists listened for stress markers. None of them found signs of hallucination or panic. What they did find was hesitation followed by clarity. Valentich did not rush his descriptions. He searched for the right words. That behavior suggested genuine observation rather than imagination. At the same time, his descriptions were oddly neutral. He did not embellish, he did not speculate, he simply stated what he believed was happening in front of him. This neutrality made the case harder to dismiss and harder to explain. Another overlooked detail was Valentich's altitude. He was flying low enough that stars alone should not have appeared to pass directly overhead in the way he described, unless the aircraft itself was changing attitude significantly. That possibility points back to disorientation. But again, disorientation severe enough to cause that illusion usually affects speech and decision-making. Valentich's speech remained intact. Some experts proposed a hybrid explanation. Valentich may have been partially disoriented, not enough to lose control immediately, but enough to misinterpret visual cues while still believing he was flying normally. In that state, even small banking motions could create the illusion of an external object moving independently. The longer the illusion persisted, the more convincing it would feel. If this is what happened, then Valentich was not panicking. He was problem-solving, and problem-solving can be dangerous when the problem is misidentified. Instead of correcting attitude or declaring an emergency, Valentich continued monitoring what he believed was circling him. Each second spent observing was a second not spent recovering orientation. That explanation fits aviation psychology, but it still does not explain the final sound. 17 seconds is long enough for a sequence of events, not an instant failure, not a single collision. Something unfolding. Some analysts believe the sound could have been the aircraft entering a steep spiral, airflow roaring past the fuselage, the antenna vibrating violently. Others believe it could have been the propeller striking water repeatedly as the aircraft impacted at an angle. Both scenarios are plausible, neither can be proven. And then there is the human element that no investigation could fully measure. Valentich's interest in UFOs. Friends later confirmed that he followed UFO reports closely and discussed them often. This detail is frequently misused. It does not mean Valentich imagined the encounter, but it does mean his mind had a framework ready if something ambiguous appeared. Expectation shapes interpretation, especially under stress. When reality becomes unclear, the brain fills gaps using familiar patterns. That does not make the experience unreal. It makes it human. But this explanation, too, leaves a gap. Because expectation alone does not create sustained, shared observations. And while Valentich was alone in the cockpit, ground witnesses later described lights that night as well. Those reports are unreliable. Memory degrades. Stories merge. Media influence distorts. But their existence prevents the case from collapsing into a single explanation. The fragment found on Flinders Island did not help. It provided just enough physical possibility to keep questions alive, but not enough certainty to answer them. Over time, investigators stopped asking what Valentich saw and began asking why the case remained unresolved. The answer was uncomfortable. Because the Valentich disappearance sits at the intersection of perception, environment, and evidence loss. Three forces that, when aligned, erase clarity almost completely. The ocean removes physical proof. The night removes visual reference. The mind fills the gaps. Together they create a situation where certainty cannot survive. That is why decades later the Valentich case still divides opinion. It is not a debate between believers and skeptics. It is a debate between explanations that all fail somewhere. And so the case remains open not because investigators stopped working, but because there is nothing left to work with. No wreckage to examine, no instruments to read, no final position to mark. Only a voice describing something that cannot be revisited. And as long as that recording exists, the question will remain. Was Frederick Valentich describing an illusion that felt real enough to kill him, or was he describing something that should not have been there at all? The case never answers that question. It only leaves us with the moment where certainty disappeared and silence took its place. As time went on, the Valentich disappearance began to change meaning depending on who was listening. For pilots, it became a cautionary example taught quietly, not as a mystery, but as a reminder of how unforgiving night flight over water can be. For investigators, it became a case defined by limits, not a failure of effort, but a failure of access. Without wreckage, without instruments, without a final location, the investigation could only circle the same facts without advancing. And for the public, the case became something else entirely. It became a rare moment where uncertainty was preserved instead of erased. Most mysteries fade because new information replaces speculation. Valentich's did the opposite. The longer it existed, the more the absence of answers became the story itself. What keeps the case alive is not the word UFO, but the recording. Strip away the labels and what remains is a young man calmly reporting something that does not fit his understanding of the world. There is no exaggeration in his voice, no attempt to convince, no awareness that his words will be replayed decades later. He is not performing, he is communicating. That makes the recording unsettling in a way few mysteries are. You are not hearing a story shaped by hindsight. You are hearing confusion as it happens. This is also why the Valentich case resists resolution. Any explanation must account not just for the disappearance, but for the experience that preceded it. If it was disorientation, then it shows how completely perception can replace reality under the right conditions, not briefly, not vaguely, but convincingly enough to feel external and persistent. If it was something else, then it demonstrates how little trace an encounter can leave, Even when it unfolds in real time and is documented, both conclusions are unsettling. The ocean plays a quiet but central role here. Water absorbs evidence. It erases impact. It removes closure. Events that happen over land leave scars. Events that happen over open sea often leave nothing. That is why aviation history contains so many stories like this. Flights that begin normally and end in silence, not because no one looked for them, but because there was nothing left to find. In Valentich's case, that silence began before the disappearance itself. It began in the moment where his words stopped making sense to the person listening on the other end of the radio. After that point, no one could help him. Not because they didn't try, but because distance, darkness, and uncertainty had already closed in. There was no dramatic final message, no last coordinate, no confirmation of impact. Just a sound that lasted 17 seconds and then nothing. Frederick Valentich's name appears in records as missing, presumed dead. His story appears in discussions as unresolved, debated, and unsettled. But what actually remains is simpler than all of that. A routine flight, a calm voice, an experience that could not be shared clearly enough to be resolved, and an ending that never arrived. That is why the Valentich disappearance still matters. Not because it promises an answer, but because it reminds us how easily certainty can fail when environment, perception, and evidence all disappear at once. The story does not ask you to believe in anything extraordinary. It only asks you to listen to what was said, notice what was missing, and accept that sometimes, even with a recording, the truth does not surface. Somewhere over the Bass Strait, a small aircraft vanished into darkness, and everything that happened after that moment remains unseen.